You have been listening to Critical Mass Radio. You are listening to the Critical Mass Radio Show, Orange County's business talk show, focused on exploring topics of interest to CEOs who are leading middle market companies. With your host, Richard Franzi.
And welcome to this edition of Critical Mass Radio Show and Podcast. I am your host, Richard Franzi. This is podcast episode number 1048, and do we have a good show planned for you. I've been so excited about having this show since I talked to Dr. Farka last week. If you're interested in what is the latest in the economic forecast, then I've invited Dr. Farka here. She's a co-director of the Wood Center for Economic Analysis and Forecasting to talk about and give you insights into their 23rd economic outlook and forecast. Dr. Farka, welcome to Critical Mass Radio Show.
Thank you, Rick. Always a pleasure.
It's awesome. So I heard you and the Dean and Neil Puri, talk last week on this subject, but let's start off. We're going to just I'm cherry picking some of the parts of the report, ladies and gentlemen, that I think you might be most interested in as business leaders across the country, but also we're going to tell you how you can get the full report if you're interested in that later in the show. So you start off this report with a very hopeful tone regarding the current political leadership and the potential policies in Washington, D.C. So this is not a political question, but as a trained economist, what is the foundation for your optimism relative to the potential policies coming out of D.C.?
So in a sense, actually, that's a very important question. We do think that the economic outlook going forward depends largely on the policies that will be enacted in Washington, both on the fiscal side and on the monetary policy side. I know we're going to talk more about monetary policy in a little bit, but in the fiscal side, the report itself, and even the way we kind of discussed this issue at the conference last week, it was mostly a tongue-in-cheek sort of proposition. We did think at the beginning of the year, with the majorities in the Congress, both in the Congress and the Senate, in the Republican intent, and also the White House having Republican, there was quite a bit of euphoria early in the year about a number of reforms and a raft of things that Congress was and the administration were supposed to work on: tax reform, regulatory reform, healthcare reform, and in a sense, so that was the euphoria that it started with. In a sense, we've seen very little done. So that had more of a sense of it. So what we're trying to convey there is more of a sense of disappointment that we've got very little done. But we haven't given up hope altogether. Some of the direction is correct. For example, on the regulatory side, we've seen some things enacted, some regulations that were put in place by the previous administration, especially the last year, have been rolled back somewhat. Of course, you have to be prudent about those things, but these things have kind of rolled back a little bit. Well, we haven't seen much in terms of the tax reform or even the healthcare repeal and replace. That sort of went nowhere. So the hopeful tone was mostly about sort of the directional shift that would be more pro-growth and pro-business.
So we're talking with Dr. Mira Farka. She is the co-director for the Wood Center for Economic Analysis and Forecasting. So again, I just want to make sure my audience understands. I'm not asking you to say anything political. I'm asking you for a dispassionate economist look at what the economy could benefit from policies. And so that's the reason for that question.
Sure, no,
Okay.
and I'd be more than happy to elaborate further. I mean, tax reform, I think, is the number one sort of in the agenda, and I think they're taking up on it. They're actually going to look into it. We still have to wait and see what's going to come out. But certainly, especially on the corporate side, that's a very important change in direction. I mean, corporate taxes, if the marginal rate is about 35%, is the highest in the OECD. OECD average is about 22.5%. So we're not even at the OECD average. So even if they lower the corporate tax rate, for example, it's going to be harder to fit to the 20% that they've actually they've proposed. Our view is going to be somewhere in the 25-28% range, but that by itself will bring it closer to the OECD average. So those are important shifts. And again, the tax reform itself, we think the bigger bang for the buck, if they get their act together and they do pass a bill, the bigger bang for the buck will be on the corporate side and the small business side rather than individual side.
And I had a listener ask me to have you explain what the acronym was that you said. I think it was OECD.
OECD, right?
OECD.
The organization for the OECD, right? The advanced economies. There are about 24 countries actually that fall into there. Those are the most advanced economies that fall in that definition.
Okay.
So, U.S. certainly is one of those countries, but we do have the highest corporate tax rate among all of the other industrialized advanced economies.
Okay, so I want to just let everyone know in the audience we're not going to be getting close to what might be viewed as a political endorsement or conversation. We're actually going to turn our attention to something else. You detail in the report how well the U.S. economy has been doing, and you see positives in foreign markets as well. I mean, can you highlight how the European and the Asian economies are doing? It's almost like, as you and the Dean talked last week, there was a lot of positive information that you were able to give about varying economies around the world, and I just wanted you to help my audience to see what you're seeing.
Right, and I mean, and that's one of the big changes that has happened this year compared to last year. Things are looking better, not just at home, fundamentally speaking, leaving aside Washington and politics. But even things are looking better at home. The U.S. economy is firing in more cylinders, but so is the global economy. Just to go over in detail a bit more, Eurozone seems to have kind of woken from this deep sleep that's been over the last really 7 years since the crisis. This is the sovereign crisis that they experienced, and they've been on the brink of recession a few times since that. In fact, the Eurozone economy performed better than the U.S. last year. U.S. grew by 1.6%, Eurozone by 1.8%. Earlier this year, Eurozone economy also performed better, although the U.S. has come back roaring the second half of the year. And again, the crisis seems to be more of a background, but improvement in Europe seems to be widespread. Business confidence is up, consumer confidence, consumer spending is up, business investment seems to be up. But the good news is elsewhere as well. Same thing happens in Asia. Japan has had a good raft of data the last 6 quarters. In fact, it has put together a string of growth for 6 straight quarters, something they didn't do for the last 10 years.
Right.
And again, there as well, things seem to be both consumer spending and business investment. China, which was a big worry last year about, because people were concerned that they were actually going to slow down dramatically. They've been managed to do very well, still growing at about 6.5% to 7% rate. In fact, every quarter, that growth rate seems to be closer to 7% than 6.5%. So things are going back. Now, China is a bit of a different story because, of course, a lot of it is done through government largesse. So government kind of encourage increases in credit expansion, which has its own issues because it may potentially create a debt bubble, which we think it has. But for the time being, things are looking good all around.
So, Dr. Farka has been on this program since she was struggling to find any good news during the Great Recession, and my, how far we've come over the years. I have about 2 minutes before our break, but I wanted to, without getting too wonky, could you help my audience of business owners and CEOs by explaining what is meant by the Fed's balance sheet, especially as it relates to their holdings and investments?
Right. So one of the things that the Federal Reserve did right after the crisis, in fact, since the height of the crisis in 2008 and especially early 2009, and then 2 more times ever since, was to buy large-scale asset purchases. That's what they call it, the LSAP program, right? So they purchased MBSs, so mortgage-backed securities. These were those toxic instruments that were in trouble because of the housing crisis. They own right now, and they've been buying them in waves since 2009. They stopped buying in October 2014. So when it comes to MBSs, they own about 1.7 trillion, which is about almost 30% of the market. They also purchased, of course, they even did even a much larger purchase on the Treasury securities with different maturities. First, it was short-term and then longer-term maturities, about $2.6 trillion on that, and that's about 17-18% of the market. So the balance sheet of the Fed basically exploded from about $800 billion prior to the recession to about $4.5 trillion right now. And since then, they've kept it constant. Since October 2014, when they stopped purchasing, they've kept it constant at that rate by reinvesting the proceeds from the Treasury and the MBS securities. Of course, now they're in the verge of doing exactly the opposite and unwinding their balance sheet. This helped the economy because overall, all this government, all the Fed policies, there's a lot of research on this in the area. The researchers seem to have discovered that all of the quantitative easing probably lowered long-term interest rates by about 1 percentage point, which matters, especially in cases when the economy is having such tough time, not only during the recession, but during the very anemic recovery.
So we're talking with Dr. Mira Farka. She's co-director for the Woods Center for Economic Analysis and Forecasting. We're looking at some of the content of the 23rd Economic Outlook and Forecast. We're going to take a very short break here on Critical Mass Radio Show and Podcast. And Mira, when we come back, I want to build on the question you just answered by, in your report, you identify the need for the Fed now to start reducing its balance sheet. But you also highlight this is an unprecedented act. And you know, we've not seen this before, and there's a lot of risks if the Fed doesn't do it correctly. So could you be willing to share a little bit about what you talked about at the forecast and what you wrote about when we come back from this commercial break?
Absolutely. I'd be more than happy.
So don't go anywhere, ladies and gentlemen. For our loyal listeners, you know this is like a 30-second snapshot. We'll be back after this word from me.
Richard Franzi is a highly sought-after keynote speaker on topics of interest to CEOs of middle firms across North America. Richard's talks include Killing Cats Leads to Rats, a fascinating look at how unintended consequences of CEOs' decisions impact their firm's performance. Your Gray Matter Matters, which explores how a CEO's mindset can differentiate a middle market firm and define its culture. Richard delivers talks to a variety of audiences, ranging from executive team retreats to keynotes in front of hundreds of CEOs. To learn more about his talks, visit criticalmassforbusiness.com and select the contact page or call 949-887-4104.
Welcome back to this edition of Critical Mass Radio Show and Podcast. And so during that break, some of the loyal listeners were asking, who is the young man here in the studio with me? Well, we're going to tell you after I say. A great way to stay informed about our guests is to sign up for our weekly newsletter, ladies and gentlemen. Simply visit criticalmassforbusiness.com. At the bottom of any page is a join our mailing list box. Simply type in your email address, hit subscribe. Like magic, you'll start receiving our weekly newsletter with powerful information about our upcoming guests like Dr. Farka. We only use it to give you our newsletter. We do nothing else with your email, so please, I would encourage you to subscribe. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is Alec Enrico. He is a student at the local university and studying kind of broadcasting, and he asked if he could come into the studio and see how this new media is operating. So he's here as our guest, and we love having him in the studio. But on the phone and on our focus guest is Dr. Mira Farka. She is the co-director for the Woods Center for Economic Analysis and Forecasting. We're talking just around the edges, really, about the 23rd Annual Economic Forecast, Outlook and Forecast. So before the break, I said, you write that the Fed needs to reduce its balance sheet, and you highlight this is unprecedented act. What's the risks if the Fed does this incorrectly to small business and business owners across the country?
Well, I mean, it's easy to understand that things could go wrong very quickly. Same way that quantitative easing, as I mentioned prior to the break, sort of pushed the economy forward in terms of lowering interest rates and kind of revving up the economy as well. It has largely contributed to the asset price increases that we've seen, almost 300% in the stock market gains. But the reverse could also have the reverse impact. It's easy to understand. One of the fears is that, number one, we've never been here before. It's uncharted territory. It's unprecedented territory. But second, the fear is that if the Fed unwinds its balance sheets too fast, too quick, in a jerky manner, then interest rates may spike up. I mean, you have a sellout in the treasuries in the bond market, and interest rates may spike up, and that would be pretty much the end of this recovery. It will actually snuff the life out of the recovery. We don't think that's certainly a huge risk. So we have the Fed moves as one of the main risks in our forecast. We don't think this is not our baseline. We think the Fed will proceed sort of in a slow, well-telegraphed manner. They've laid out their plans. They told us they will unwind their balance sheets by $10 billion over the next 3 months, and then increase that by another $10 billion 3 months after that, and so on, until it reaches $50 billion. And then slowly they'll continue to sort of unload the treasuries and the MBSs. But nonetheless, I mean, we have to understand that by the time the process is done, it will take them about 8 years to unload all the mortgage-backed securities. It will take them longer to unload all the treasuries. And our simple calculation shows that, even by 2021, so 4 years down the line, the balance sheet will still be big. It'll be from $4.5 trillion to around $3 trillion. So I think this is still large balance sheets, low interest rates will still be with us for times to come, and that's okay. That's actually okay, and we should get used to that idea.
We're talking with Dr. Mira Farka, and I always enjoy our conversations because economics is sort of this puzzle of interconnectedness, and no one element stands on its own. They all sort of influence and affect each other, and you do a marvelous job of helping our audience of business owners to sort of understand the complexity without getting too complex. One of the structural issues that we've talked about, unfortunately, feels like for years, Mira, is this idea of workforce participation of men in their prime earning years. And unfortunately, your latest report shows no real improvement in this cohort's participation rate. Can you help my audience of business owners and executives to understand what's the implications to the U.S. economy if this continues?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the biggest issues. And again, I love your show because we always discuss not only about what's going on, but also deep structural issues that go back 30 years, for example. And this is one of them. One of the things something new we discovered when we were looking a little bit deeper at the data preparing this forecast is that the recovery has been very uneven. But one interesting unevenness was between women and men. For example, since the start of the recovery, if you look at employment gap compared to 2007, so prior to the recession, right? If you look at employment gap for women, it was close. These are all adjusting for demographic changes, because you have to keep that in mind. The population is aging. But adjusting for demographic changes, the gap for women had been closed, but not so much for men. So we're still so, and that's because some of the jobs were created during this recovery. But this goes even further back. Is that we've created a lot more jobs in healthcare versus manufacturing. So going back historically, for example, even 20 years ago, healthcare employment was about 11 million nationwide. It's now almost double that, almost 21 million. The opposite happened in manufacturing. Back in 97, we had 18 million manufacturing jobs. We now have about 12 million. So the 6 million jobs are completely gone. There's been a little bit of uptick lately, but not that much. So certainly, prime age men who again, sort of low skill, low education, but certainly would get jobs in manufacturing. These are good, well-paid jobs, good wages. They're no longer getting those jobs, and that's the biggest secular issue that we're facing. Again, it goes a bit further back. It goes about 2 decades or so, but it really ramped up during the recession. In fact, if you look at the numbers, our calculations show there are probably about 5 million prime age working men. So that would be those men between 25 and 54 years old. That's your prime earning years. About 5 million of them who should be in the labor market, and they're not. If you look at employment levels, so even those who are actually looking for jobs, in other words, who would be unemployed, there's about 2 million of those who are unemployed looking for jobs. So these are discouraging trends, and certainly a society that is not able to answer an important question like, what do you do with 5 million discouraged men and another 2 million men that are looking for jobs and can't find them, is likely to face deeper issues. And I'm afraid that we'll see some social issues, right, pop up. We've seen them already with the opioid epidemic and so on and so forth. So we certainly need to do a better job. We're one of the countries that have done the worst in terms of enticing men to come back to work. We don't do a good job at training workers, especially men, who have been displaced by these forces of technology and globalization. We don't have any good programs. The programs are not really well funded. We need an apprentice program, which we've talked about in this show in the past, and we haven't quite gotten there yet. But certainly more money, more effort should be spent, even at the business, at the local level. Businesses and community colleges and colleges should work together to create training for this segment of population, because they're truly hurting.
You know that this conversation, unfortunately, is all too familiar, but the new data that I heard from you at the conference, you might have said it before, but I didn't hear it this time, was that when you look around the world, the United States stands out as a country that's done the worst job at getting this workforce participation back in line. And for me, that the good news is that means other countries have figured out something to do to address this, and maybe we could learn from their programs and practices.
Yeah, no, I mean, the numbers are staggering. I mean, if you compare it, going back just the turn of the millennium, since 2000, Japan, for example, has increased participation rates for prime age men by 4.1 percentage points. UK, France has increased it by 1.6%. All of the advanced economies. Only the U.S. is exceptional in the sense that only in the U.S. we've seen a drop of about 2.7 percentage points compared to the rest of the countries. So there's certainly things we could do that other countries are doing that we're actually not doing. At least we're not doing them correctly. To help the prime age men, the 25 to 54-year-old men, who are certainly not having, who have been in a secular downtrend for a while, really going back since the turn of the millennium.
And so for the people that are in their 50s, it's like it's been 20 years of this for them. So yeah, it becomes the normal, the new normal now for them. So
it's become almost 2 decades. Yes.
Mira, if someone would like to get the more detailed, and hold on, for those that are watching us on Facebook Live, here is the copy of the report. It is a great read. I'm telling you, it is actually enjoyable. I hear your voice in the way this thing is written. I feel like you're telling it to me. So, if you enjoyed this conversation, you should want to get a copy of this report. How would they get that report if they want the economic outlook and forecast?
Sure. The report has a lot more details, including our detailed numbers of the U.S. economy and all of the and the local economy, all the 6 counties of the Southern California. The report is free, and it's posted online. You can get it under, I'll read the URL. It's business.fullerton.edu/center/economic analysis and forecasting, one word. It's very easy to get. It's free, and we always post. We have a number of other reports. We post there international trade reports, OCBX, which is our survey of local businesses, will tell us what their biggest concerns are. So there are a number of free reports that are available to your listeners.
And Dr. Farka will be speaking at the Center Club here in Orange County in January, and I'll get some information out to the community as well.
Yes.
If you want to have a breakfast meeting and have an interesting time and have the economy explained to you, no one better here in Orange County than to listen to Dr. Mira Farka. Thank you for your continued support of our radio show podcast. You're a clear member and friend of the community, and it's always great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Rick. It's always a pleasure. I always enjoy it.
All right. I'd like to thank our engineer for today, none other than Mr. Paul Roberts. Our producers are Joan Park, Crystal Nunley, and Haley Stern. If you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, I am CEO Peer Groups. LinkedIn and YouTube, I'm Richard Franzi, Franzi. And my website is criticalmass4business.com. Until our next show, I hope all of your business decisions will move your company in a positive direction.
You have been listening to Critical Mass Radio Show Business Talk Show, focused on exploring topics of interest to CEOs who are leading middle market companies. With your host, Richard Franzi.
Welcome to The Strategic Investor. Join us as we interview some of the world's most productive